I'm going to tell you something that should terrify every American who still believes in the Constitution, the rule of law, and the basic dignity of democratic leadership. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it because we don't have time for pleasantries anymore. We're watching in real time as the government of the People's Republic of China, an authoritarian regime that crushes dissent, disappears critics, and operates concentration camps, publicly praises a Canadian politician while simultaneously treating the President of the United States like a second-rate carnival barker. Let that sink in for a moment. China is holding up Mark Carney as the kind of leader they respect, while Donald Trump gets the diplomatic equivalent of a pat on the head and a lollipop. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. George, why should we care what China thinks? And under normal circumstances, you'd be right. We shouldn't calibrate our democratic values based on the opinions of autocrats. But this isn't about seeking approval from Beijing. This is about what their assessment reveals, about competence, about temperament, about the catastrophic gap between what American leadership used to mean and what it has become under Trump. I'm George Conway. I'm a lawyer. I'm a constitutional conservative, and I've spent the better part of the last several years watching my former party abandon every principle it ever claimed to hold dear in service of a man who is fundamentally unfit for the office he holds. I didn't come to this position lightly. I spent decades as a Republican. I worked on some of the most significant constitutional cases of our generation. I still believe, in limited government, in the separation of powers, in the rule of law as the foundation of everything we are as a nation. But what I've watched unfold isn't conservatism. It isn't even politics as usual. It's something far more dangerous. And now we have this moment, this absurd, revealing, deeply troubling moment, where China looks at Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, the former governor of the Bank of England, a man with actual expertise in economics and finance, a man with a track record of steady, competent leadership during multiple international crises, and they see someone worthy of respect, someone serious, someone they can work with on the global stage. And then they look at Donald Trump, and what do they see? A reality television host who thinks tariffs are paid by foreign countries, a man who believes trade deficits are scored like golf, lower is better, regardless of what they actually mean, a president who has bankrupted multiple businesses, who doesn't understand basic economic principles, who conducts foreign policy like a mob shakedown. The contrast isn't subtle. It's not even close. Let me be absolutely clear about what's happening here. When Chinese officials praise Mark Carney, they're not doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't hand out compliments for fun. They're strategic. They're calculated. Every statement, every gesture from Beijing is designed to advance Chinese interests. So when they elevate Carney and diminish Trump, they're sending multiple messages simultaneously. First, they're signaling to the world that they recognize competence when they see it, and incompetence too. Second, they're driving a wedge between the United States and its allies, particularly Canada. Third, they're undermining Trump's credibility on the world stage, and they're doing it because they know he's vulnerable, because he is vulnerable, because underneath all the bluster and the bravado and the all caps tweets, there's a hollow core of insecurity and ignorance that foreign adversaries exploit with embarrassing ease. Trump has handed them this opportunity on a silver platter. His entire approach to international relations is transactional in the worst possible way. Everything is a deal. Everything is leverage. Everything is about him personally winning and someone else losing. There's no strategy. There's no coherent policy framework. There's just this chaotic pinball game where he careens from one ill-considered impulse to another, leaving diplomats and allies scrambling to clean up the mess. Mark Carney, by contrast, represents something that used to be boringly normal in democratic leadership, actual qualifications. He earned a bachelor's degree in economics from Harvard. He got a master's and a doctorate in economics from Oxford. He spent 13 years at Goldman Sachs working in their London, Tokyo, and New York offices, dealing with complex international financial systems. He became the youngest ever governor of the Bank of Canada in 2008, right as the global financial crisis hit, and he steered Canada through that crisis with remarkable success. Then he was recruited to become governor of the Bank of England, the first foreigner to hold that position in the bank's 300-plus year history. He managed monetary policy for the world's fifth largest economy during Brexit, arguably the most complex economic and political challenge Britain has faced in generations. These aren't just credentials. This is a track record. This is someone who has actually done the work, who understands how modern economies function, who can speak credibly with finance ministers and central bankers and heads of state because he's been in those rooms, making those decisions, bearing that responsibility. Now let's talk about Donald Trump's qualifications. He inherited hundreds of millions of dollars from his father. He built a real estate empire in New York largely on his father's connections and capital. He slapped his name on buildings and products, many of which failed spectacularly. He bankrupted casinos, businesses designed to extract money from customers, not once, but multiple times. He ran a fraudulent university that scammed vulnerable people out of their savings. He ran a charity that was shut down for self-dealing. His businesses have been involved in more than 3,000 lawsuits. He's been credibly accused of sexual assault by more than 24 women. He's been convicted of 34 felonies related to falsifying business records. He's been found liable for fraud in New York. He's been found liable for sexual abuse and defamation. And somehow, this is the man millions of Americans continue to support as their president. This is the man the Republican Party has wrapped itself around like a security blanket soaked in grievance and conspiracy theories. When China looks at these two men, Carney and Trump, they're not making some grand ideological statement about democracy versus authoritarianism. They're making a cold, hard assessment of competence versus chaos. And they're concluding correctly that dealing with someone like Carney is in their interests because he's predictable, rational, and capable of understanding complex policy issues. Trump, by contrast, is none of those things. He's erratic, emotional, and fundamentally incapable of grasping the nuances of international trade, monetary policy, or strategic diplomacy. You know what's particularly galling about this? Trump's supporters will spin China's praise of Carney as proof that Carney is somehow compromised, that he's soft on China, that he's a globalist puppet. They'll ignore the obvious explanation that China respects competence even when it comes from democratic leaders who might oppose them, and instead construct some elaborate conspiracy theory about how Carney is secretly working for Beijing. It's the same playbook they always use. When experts disagree with Trump, they're not just wrong, they're corrupt, they're compromised, they're part of some deep state plot. But here's the thing. You can't fake expertise. You can't bluff your way through a financial crisis. You can't tweet your way out of a currency collapse. You can't bully a recession into submission. These things require knowledge, experience, judgment, and the intellectual humility to listen to people who know more than you do about specific issues. Mark Carney has those qualities. Donald Trump not only lacks them, he's actively hostile to them. He surrounds himself with sycophants and yes men. He fires anyone who tells him uncomfortable truths. He ignores intelligence briefings. He dismisses expert advice. He operates on gut instinct and cable news rants. And the results speak for themselves. Trump's trade war with China accomplished virtually nothing except raising costs for American consumers and farmers. His tariffs didn't bring manufacturing jobs flooding back to the Midwest. They didn't force China to fundamentally reform its economic practices. What they did do was create uncertainty, disrupt supply chains, and cost American businesses and workers billions of dollars. Meanwhile, China played the long game, strengthened its relationships with other trading partners, and waited for Trump to get bored and move on to his next manufactured crisis. This is what happens when you put someone in charge who doesn't understand what they're doing. This is what happens when you prioritize loyalty over competence, when you value TV ratings over policy outcomes, when you mistake confidence for capability. Let me address something directly because I know it's coming. Some of you are going to say, I'm just another never Trumper, another establishment Republican who can't accept that the party has moved on, another elitist who looks down on ordinary Americans who support the president. And to that I say, nonsense. Complete and utter nonsense. I respect conservative principles. I believe in limited government. I believe in free markets. I believe in strong national defense. I believe in the Constitution as a bulwark against tyranny. What I don't respect, what I will never respect, is the abandonment of those principles in service of a con man who has turned the presidency into a reality show. and the Republican Party into a personality cult. Supporting Trump isn't conservative. It's not even particularly political. It's tribal. It's emotional. It's about owning the libs and triggering the media and feeling like you're part of some grand movement to take back the country from imagined enemies. But it's not about governance. It's not about policy. It's certainly not about the Constitution or the rule of law, because Trump tramples on both with gleeful abandon. And when China recognizes that, when they see the difference between a serious leader like Mark Carney and a carnival barker like Donald Trump, that should be a wake-up call. Not because we should care what Beijing thinks, but because it reveals how far we've fallen. It reveals how much damage Trump has done to America's standing in the world. It reveals how thoroughly he's squandered the credibility and respect that previous generations of Americans, Democrat and Republican alike, spent decades building. You want to know what really bothers me about this? It's not just Trump's incompetence, though that's certainly bad enough. It's the way his supporters have convinced themselves that incompetence is somehow a virtue, that not knowing things is authentic, that expertise is elitism, that someone like Mark Carney, who has spent his entire career mastering incredibly complex subjects and using that knowledge to serve the public good, is somehow less worthy than a reality TV host who can't spell hamburger correctly. This is madness. This is how democracies die. Not with tanks in the streets, but with the slow erosion of standards, the gradual acceptance of behavior that would have been disqualifying a generation ago, the collective shrug that accompanies each new violation of norms and laws and basic decency. China understands this. They've been watching it unfold in real time. They've seen how Trump has alienated allies, abandoned international agreements, withdrawn from global leadership positions. They've seen how he's more interested in settling personal scores than advancing American interests. They've seen how he's turned the Justice Department into his personal law firm, how he's attempted to extort foreign leaders for political favors, how he's obstructed investigations into his own conduct, how he's incited a violent attack on the Capitol to overturn an election he lost. And they've concluded rationally, coldly, strategically, that this is a moment of American weakness, a moment to exploit, a moment to expand their influence while we're distracted by our own internal dysfunction. That's what makes China's praise of Mark Carney so significant. They're not just commenting on Carney's qualifications, they're highlighting America's lack thereof. They're pointing out that the world's oldest democracy has elevated someone to its highest office who is manifestly unfit for the job, while other democracies, like Canada, still value competence and expertise. Now, I want to be very careful here, because I'm not suggesting Mark Carney is perfect. I'm not endorsing him for any particular office. I don't agree with all of his policy positions. But that's not the point. The point is that he represents a baseline level of competence that should be non-negotiable in democratic leadership. He represents the idea that people in positions of power should actually know what they're doing, should have demonstrated capability in relevant fields, should be able to engage with complex issues in sophisticated ways. Donald Trump represents the opposite of all that. He represents the triumph of celebrity over substance, of ego over expertise, of grievance over governance. And the fact that China recognizes this difference, the fact that they're willing to publicly acknowledge it, should be humiliating for every American who still cares about our country's reputation and influence in the world. But here's what really keeps me up at night. I don't think Trump's supporters care. I don't think they're embarrassed. I think they've so thoroughly bought into the cult of personality that they can rationalize anything, excuse anything, ignore anything that doesn't fit their preferred narrative. China praises a competent leader over Trump. Must be a conspiracy. Career diplomats testify about Trump's misconduct. Deep state operatives, federal judges rule against Trump. Partisan hacks, intelligence agencies provide evidence of Russian interference. Fake news. There's no fact, no piece of evidence, no testimony from credible witnesses that can penetrate this bubble. And that's by design. Trump has spent years conditioning his supporters to reject any information that comes from sources he doesn't control. He's created an alternate reality where he's always the hero, always the victim, always being unfairly persecuted by shadowy forces that want to destroy him, and by extension, destroy you. It's a brilliant con in its way. morally reprehensible, catastrophically damaging to our democracy, but tactically brilliant. Because once you've convinced people that they can't trust anyone but you can get away with anything. You can betray allies. You can kowtow to dictators. You can profit from the presidency. You can obstruct justice. You can incite violence. And your supporters will not only excuse it, they'll defend it, rationalize it, attack anyone who questions it. This is how republics fall, not all at once, but gradually as institutions are hollowed out, as norms are abandoned, as the distinction between truth and lies becomes increasingly blurred, as people retreat into tribal identities and reject shared reality. And what's particularly insidious is that Trump has convinced millions of Americans that they're the ones defending democracy, that they're the ones standing up for American values, that they're the patriots, while everyone who opposes Trump is somehow un-American, somehow traitorous, somehow part of a vast conspiracy to undermine the will of the people. It's projection of the highest order. Trump, who has violated his oath of office repeatedly, who has shown contempt for constitutional limits on presidential power, who attempted to overturn a legitimate election through fraud and violence, has somehow positioned himself as the defender of democracy against elites who supposedly don't respect ordinary Americans. Meanwhile, people like Mark Carney, who have dedicated their careers to public service, who have used their expertise to help ordinary people weather economic crises, who have operated with integrity and competence, are dismissed as globalist villains. The world is watching all of this. Our allies are watching. Our adversaries are watching. And they're drawing conclusions about American power, American credibility, American leadership. China's praise of Carney isn't happening in a vacuum. It's part of a larger pattern where authoritarian regimes are testing democratic resilience, exploiting democratic weaknesses, and positioning themselves as more effective, more stable, more capable than the chaotic democracies they seek to supplant. And they're finding evidence to support their case. Not because democracy is inherently weak, but because we've allowed someone like Donald Trump to capture our highest office and turn it into a vehicle for personal enrichment and ego gratification. This matters more than most people realize. The post-World War II international order was built on American leadership, not because we were perfect, not because we always got it right, but because we generally tried to align our power with principles, because we built alliances based on shared values, because we created institutions designed to prevent the kind of great power conflicts that had devastated the world twice in the first half of the 20th century. Trump has systematically undermined all of that. He's treated NATO like a protection racket. He's cozied up to dictators while insulting democratic allies. He's withdrawn from international agreements on climate, on trade, on arms control. He's weakened the credibility of American commitments. He's turned foreign policy into a transactional game where everything is for sale to the highest bidder or the most flattering supplicant. And into this vacuum, China is stepping. They're building influence through their Belt and Road Initiative. They're creating alternative international institutions. They're positioning themselves as a more reliable partner than the United States. And they're doing it while we're consumed by our own internal dysfunction, while we're arguing about whether reality is real, while we're defending a president who couldn't pass a basic civics test. Mark Carney understands these dynamics. He spent years operating at the intersection of economics, finance, and geopolitics. He knows how power works in the modern world. He knows that credibility matters, that expertise matters, that consistency matters. These aren't just abstract values. They're practical necessities for effective leadership in a complex, interconnected global system. Trump understands none of this. He thinks international relations are like negotiating a real estate deal in Manhattan. He thinks you can bully and bluster your way to victory. He thinks personal chemistry with dictators matters more than institutional relationships with democracies. He thinks climate change is a hoax invented by China to hurt American manufacturing. He thinks trade deficits are inherently bad, regardless of what they actually represent economically. This level of ignorance would be disqualifying for a middle management position at most serious organizations, but somehow it's acceptable, more than acceptable, celebrated for the presidency of the United States. I want to be clear about something. This isn't partisan. This isn't about Democrat versus Republican. Some of the sharpest critics of Trump's incompetence have been Republican foreign policy experts, Republican economists, Republican legal scholars, people who spent their careers serving Republican administrations, who share conservative values, who understand that you can disagree about policy while still maintaining basic standards of competence and integrity. But those voices have been marginalized within the party. Anyone who criticizes Trump is labeled a Reno, a never Trumper, a traitor to the cause. The party has become an enforcement mechanism for absolute loyalty to one man, regardless of what he does, regardless of what principles he violates, regardless of what damage he causes. And the rest of us are left to watch in horror as the country we love, the Constitution we revere, the democratic institutions we depend on are systematically degraded by a president who views them as obstacles to his personal will rather than as foundations of our national strength. China sees all of this. They see the chaos, the corruption, the incompetence, and they're making strategic decisions based on what they observe. When they praise Mark Carney, they're not just complimenting a capable technocrat. They're sending a message about what they value in international partners, about what kind of leadership they take seriously, about where they see the future heading. The question for Americans is whether we're going to recognize what's happening and do something about it, or whether we're going to continue sleepwalking toward a future where the United States is a diminished power, a laughingstock on the world stage, a cautionary tale about what happens when a democracy abandons its commitment to competence and embraces demagoguery instead. I know that sounds dramatic. I know some of you will think I'm being hyperbolic, but I'm a lawyer. I deal in evidence. I deal in facts. And the facts are these. Donald Trump is fundamentally unfit for the presidency. He lacks the knowledge, the temperament, the character, and the commitment to constitutional principles that the office requires. He has used his position to enrich himself and his family. He has obstructed justice repeatedly. He has incited violence against his perceived enemies. He has attempted to overturn a legitimate election. He has been credibly accused of serious crimes, including sexual assault and financial fraud. He has been convicted of felonies. He has demonstrated again and again that he values personal loyalty over national interest, that he views the law as something to be manipulated rather than upheld, that he sees democratic norms as weaknesses to exploit rather than strengths to preserve. And yet millions of Americans continue to support him, continue to make excuses for him, continue to attack anyone who points out these obvious truths. That's the real crisis. Not Trump himself. He's always been exactly who he is, a narcissistic con man with authoritarian impulses. But the willingness of so many Americans to embrace him despite overwhelming evidence of his unfitness. China doesn't have that problem. China's leaders may be authoritarian, but they're not stupid. They recognize competence when they see it. They understand that effective governance requires knowledge and expertise. They promote people based on demonstrated capability within their system. You can criticize their values, their human rights record, their lack of democratic accountability, and you should, but you can't accuse them of elevating obviously unqualified people to the highest levels of power purely based on their ability to generate headlines and rally crowds. We used to have higher standards. We used to expect our presidents to be competent, to be knowledgeable, to be capable of growth and learning, to surround themselves with qualified advisors and actually listen to them. We didn't always get perfect leaders, but we generally got people who took the job seriously, who understood the weight of the responsibility, who recognized that the presidency is about serving the country, not themselves. Donald Trump represents the complete inversion of that expectation. And the praise China offers to someone like Mark Carney is a reminder of how far we've fallen, how thoroughly we've abandoned the standards that made American leadership credible and effective for generations. So here's my final word, and I want you to hear this clearly. We are at a crossroads. The choice before us isn't complicated. It's not about policy minutia or partisan advantage. It's about whether we want leaders who know what they're doing or whether we want to continue down this path of incompetence masquerading as authenticity, of ignorance dressed up as common sense, of corruption defended as political persecution. China has made its assessment. The world has made its assessment. The only question remaining is whether the American people will finally face the truth about what we've become and whether we have the courage to demand better before it's too late. The Constitution doesn't enforce itself. Democracy doesn't defend itself. These things require citizens who value truth over tribalism, who demand competence over celebrity, who recognize that expertise isn't elitism, it's the foundation of effective governance in a complex world. Mark Carney didn't earn China's praise by being weak or compromised. He earned it by being competent. And in this moment, competence itself has become a rebuke to American leadership.